The Daily Life of the Aztecs on the Eve of the Spanish Conquest. Chapter 5. From Birth to Death. Baptism, the reading of the omens, giving the name, childhood and youth, education, infancy, the two systems of public education, marriage, family life, leaving school, role of the marriage brokers, weddings, chief and secondary wives, the polygamous family, a woman's status in Aztec society, adultery and divorce, birth of a child, apotheosis of women dying in childbirth, sickness and old age, physicians and healing women, accepted opinions on sickness, charms and spells, medicinal plants, place of the old in society, the rite and the significance of confession, death and the hereafter, the funeral rites. Baptism. When a child was born into a Mexican family, the midwife who had taken care of the delivery acted as priest and saw to the fulfillment of the rites. It was she who addressed the baby and welcomed it, saluting it with the names of precious stone, quetzal feather, and at the same time warning it of the uncertainty and the sorrows of life. Here you are, come into this world where your parents live in toil and weariness, where there is overmuch heat, and cold and wind. We cannot tell if you will live among us. We cannot tell what kind of fate will be yours. All these traditional themes were to be repeated an indefinite number of times in the ceremonies that followed. The midwife cut the baby's umbilical cord, but not without haranguing him at length. If it were a boy, she said to him, "Dear son, you must understand that your home is not here where you have been born, for you are a warrior, you are a cacholi bird, and this house where you have just been born is only a nest. Your mission is to give the sun the blood of enemies to drink and feed Tlautecutli, the earth, with their bodies. Your country, your inheritance, and your father are in the house of the sun, in the sky." And to a girl she would say, "As the heart stays in the body, so you must stay in the house. You must never go out of the house. You must be like the embers in the hearth." Thus, from the first moment, the man was devoted to the fate of a warrior, and to the woman to that of a Cinderella, seated by the fireside. Then the midwife washed the child, praying to Chalchiutlique, the goddess of water. "Goddess, be pleased that his heart and his life may be purified, that the water may carry away all stain. For this child puts himself in your hands, O Chalchiutlique, mother and sister of gods." As soon as the birth was known in the family and the locality, or even for the great families as far off as in other cities, the complex ceremonial of these salutations began. The old women of the family thanked the midwife solemnly, and she answered in a speech full of imagery. Chosen orators, usually old men, went to greet the newborn child, and other old men appointed for the purpose answered with long discourses. The Aztecs' taste for rhetoric found satisfaction in endless pompous dissertations upon the favor of the gods and the mysteries of fate. Times beyond number the baby was compared to a necklace, to a jewel of precious stones, to a rare feather. The child's mother was extolled, she who was the peer of the goddess Sihuacuat Cuilatzli. They boasted about the glorious history of the family. If the father were a dignitary or a lawyer, he was reminded of his office and its great importance and its great weight in the courts and in the government of the state. "Lord," they said to him, "it is truly your image, your likeness. You have a scion, you have flowered." From time to time, and this was one of the obligatory figures in the fine language, the orator would excuse himself for going on too long. "I am afraid of wearying you and of giving you pains in your heads and your stomachs." Then he would go on with renewed vigor. Those who spoke on behalf of the family would return thanks in an equally garrulous manner. At last, those who had come to greet the baby gave their presents. There would be as many as 20 or 40 cloaks or suits of clothes among people of the ruling class. But among the plebeians, the presents would only be food and drink. During these festivities, the father would send for the tonalpoki, or soothsayer, a specialist in the study of sacred books. This person, who was offered a meal, as well as his fee of cloth and turkeys, began by asking the exact moment of the birth, so that he might decide what sign the child was born under. He then consulted his Tonalamat to find the sign of the day of the birth and the set of 13 days to which it belonged. If the sign of the day were considered good and fortunate, he could say, "Your son is born under a good sign. He will be a lord or a senator, rich, brave, pugnacious. He will be courageous, and he will shine in war. He will reach high rank among the commanders of armies." And then one could go on to the naming of the child the next day. But if the sign of the day proved to be calamitous, then the Tonalpoki exercised his wit to find a better sign in the same set of 13, as nearly as possible in the following 4 days. "The child is not born under a good sign," he would say, "but in this series there is another reasonable sign that will diminish and correct the unfortunate influence of the principal sign." This was usually possible, since the signs that carried figures greater than 10 were always favorable, as well as those that had the figure 7. At a pinch, it was possible to delay the baptism for more than the ordinarily allowed 4 days. The naming itself was carried out not by the soothsayer, nor by a priest, but by the midwife. The ceremony had 2 parts, the ritual washing of the child and the actual naming. They began by getting ready a great deal of food and drink for the family feast that would follow the baptism. They also made a little shield, a bow with 4 arrows, each corresponding to one of the cardinal points, if the child were a boy, and little spindles, a shuttle and a box if it were a girl. All the relatives and friends gathered in the mother's house before sunrise. As soon as day broke, they arranged the symbolic objects in the inner courtyard or in the garden. The midwife, provided with a full water jar, addressed the baby, saying, "Eagle, jaguar, valiant warrior, O my grandson, here you are come into this world, sent by your father and mother, the great god and the great goddess. You have been made and begotten in your own place. Among the almighty gods, the great god and the great goddess who live alone in the 9 heavens. It is Quetzalcoatl, who is in all places, who has done you this kindness. Now be joined to your mother, the goddess of war, Chalchiutlique, Chalchiutlatonac." With her wet fingers she set some drops of water on his mouth. "Take and receive this, for it is with this water that you will live upon earth, and grow green again. It is by water that we have what we must have to live upon this earth. Receive this water." After this, she touched the baby's chest with her wet hand and said, "Here is the heavenly water, the very pure water that washes and cleans your heart, and that takes away all stain." Then she threw some drops on his head. "Let this water enter into your body, and may it live there, this heavenly water, the blue celestial water." Lastly, she washed off the child's whole body, saying the formula meant to keep off evil. "Wherever you may be, you who might do this child a mischief, leave him. Go away from him. For now this child is born again. He is newborn and newborn by our mother, Chalchiutlique." After the 4 water rites, the midwife presented the child 4 times to the sky, invoking the sun and the astral gods. In this way, the traditional gestures were regulated by the holy number. The last formula also invoked the earth, the divine spouse of the sun. And taking the shield and the arrows, the midwife begged the gods that the boy might become a courageous warrior, so that he may go into your palace of delights where the brave who die in battle rest and rejoice. The ceremony for naming the girls was similar, but the baby was not presented to the sun, which was the god of men and warriors. After the ritual washing, the midwife and the relatives, in a touching ceremony, spoke to the cradle in which the little girl would lie, calling it Yawaltisit, the healer by night, and saying, "You who are her mother, take her, old goddess, do her no harm, watch over her kindly." When these rites were over, the name of the child was chosen and announced. The ancient Mexicans had no surnames, but some names were often handed down from grandfather to grandson in the same family. The birthday was also taken into consideration. A child who was born during the set of 13 days that was ruled by the same Se Miquitzli, under the influence of Tezcatlipoca, received one of the appellations of this god. In some tribes, and particularly among the Mixtecs, each person was called by the day of his birth, usually followed by a nickname. For example, 7-flower, eagle's feather, or 4-rabbit garland of flowers. There was a very great variety in Mexican personal names. Taking them at random from the text, one finds such names as Acamapichli, handful of reeds, Chimalpopoca, smoking shield, Itzcoat, obsidian snake, Xiucoscat, turquoise necklace, Cualcoat, eagle snake, Citlacoat, snake of stars, Tlacateot, godlike man, and Cuatlatoa, speaking eagle. Women were given charming names like Matlaxochit, green flower, Cuiaxochit, rainflower, Miahuaxiuti, turquoise maize flower, and Atotot, waterbird. All these names, like those of the villages, mountains, etc., could be represented by pictograms in the manuscript records. The ceremony closed with a family banquet, at the end of which the old men and women might give themselves up to the pleasures of drink. Childhood and youth education. In the Codex Mendoza, there is a series of pictures divided into 2 columns, the one on the left for the boys, the one on the right for the girls, which shows these stages in the education of a Mexican child. This education seems to have been one of the parents' chief cares and to have been carried out with a great deal of concern and firmness. At the same time, this table shows the rations that each child was allowed. Half a cake of maize at each meal for a 3-year-old, 1 cake at 4 and 5 years, a cake and a half from 6 to 12 years, and 2 cakes from 13 onwards. These rations were the same for both sexes. To judge by this manuscript, the education of a boy was entrusted to his father between the age of 3 and 15 years, and that of a girl to her mother. This very probably means that such was the case in families in modest circumstances, for judges and important officials obviously did not have the necessary time for educating their children personally. Besides, as will be seen later, the family's part in education usually ceased much earlier. The pictures in the Codex Mendoza also show how the children were dressed. On occasion, the boys up to the age of 13 wore a small cloak tied at the shoulder, but they did not wear the mashlat. It was only after 13, at the beginning of the man's estate, that they appeared in a loincloth. The little girls, on the other hand, wore the usual blouse from the beginning and a skirt which, although it began very short, very soon descended to their ankles. During the first years, the parents' teaching was limited to good advice. A blue scroll, the color of the precious stone, is shown coming from their lips, and showing them how to do little domestic tasks. The boy learnt to carry water and wood, and to go to the marketplace with his father and pick up the maize scattered on the ground. The little girl watched her mother spinning, but did not begin to handle the spindle herself until she was 6. From 7 to 14, the boys learned to fish and to manage boats on the lake, while the girl spun cotton, swept the house, ground the maize on the metlat, and at last began to learn the use of the loom, a very delicate instrument in pre-Columbian Mexico. It was an essentially practical education, and a very severe one. Punishments rained down upon an idle child, whose parents would scratch him with agave thorns or compel him to breathe the acrid fumes of a fire in which red peppers were burning. Mexican teachers seem to have been very much in favor of the iron hand. Still, according to the Codex Mendoza, it was at 15 that the youths might enter either the Calmecac, a temple or monastery in which they were entrusted to priests, or the school called the Telpochcali, the house of the young man, which was run by masters chosen from among the experienced warriors. But here, the document is in disagreement with the most authoritative texts. It seems that the education at home stopped much earlier. Some fathers sent their children to the Calmecac as soon as they could walk, and in any case they went to school between 6 and 9 years of age. As we have seen, there were 2 possibilities open to a family, the Calmecac and the Telpochcali. In theory, the Calmecac was kept for the sons and daughters of the dignitaries, but the children of the trading class which were also admitted, and there is a passage in Sahagun which seems to say that the children of the plebeian families could also go there. This supposition is strengthened by the fact that the high priests were chosen without any regard to their family, but only to their morals, their practices, their knowledge of doctrine, and the purity of their lives. Yet it was obligatory for a priest to have been brought up in the Calmecac. There were several Calmecac in Mexico, each attached to a given temple. The Mexicat Teotihuacan, the vicar general of the Mexican Church, was in charge of their administration and of the education of the boys and girls in them. Each district, on the other hand, had several telpochcali, which were administered by the telpochtlatoque, the masters of the young men, or for the girls by the ichpochtlatoque, mistresses of the girls, who were not religious but lay officials. In general, the higher education given in the Calmecac prepared the pupils either for the priesthood or for the high offices of the state. It was rigid and severe. The Telpochcali produced ordinary citizens, although this did not prevent some of them from reaching the highest rank, and its pupils had much more freedom and were much less harshly treated than those in the religious school. There was no right of uninterrupted sleep for the scholars of the Calmecac. They had to get up in the darkness to go into the mountains, each by himself, to offer incense to the gods and draw blood from their ears and legs with agave thorns. They were obliged to undergo frequent and rigorous fasts. They had to work hard on the temple's land, and they were severely punished for the least fault. The whole emphasis of this education was upon sacrifice and abnegation. "Listen, my son," said a father to a boy about to enter a Calmecac. "You are not going to be honored, nor obeyed, nor esteemed. You are going to be looked down upon, humiliated, and despised. Every day you will cut agave thorns for penance, and you will draw blood from your body with these spines, and you will bathe at night even when it is very cold. Harden your body to the cold. And when the time comes for fasting, do not go and break your fast, but put a good face upon both fasting and penance." Above all, it was a school of self-control and of firmness towards oneself. The pupils were also taught to speak well, to make proper salutations, and to bow. And lastly, the priests taught the young men all the songs that are called holy, which were written in their books by means of their characters, as well as the astrology of the Indians, the interpretation of dreams, and the reckoning of the years. Girls were consecrated to the temple from their earliest days, either to stay there for a given number of years or until they should be married. They were under the direction and the instruction of the elderly priestesses, and they lived chastely, growing expert in the working of beautifully embroidered materials, taking part in the ritual and offering incense to the gods several times a night. They had the title of priestesses. How very different and how very much less austere was the life of the other young people. It is true that the boy who went to the Telpochcali had many disagreeable and commonplace tasks, such as the sweeping of the communal house, and he went with the others in bands to cut wood for the school or to take part in public works, the repairing of ditches and canals, and the cultivation of the common land. But at sunset, all the youths went to sing and dance in a house called Cuicacalco, the house of singing, and the boys danced with the other young men until after midnight, and those that had mistresses went off to sleep with them. There was little room in their education for the religious exercises, the fasts, and the penances, which had so much importance in that of the pupils of the Calmecac. Everything was done to prepare them for war. From their earliest age they associated only with experienced warriors, whose exploits they admired and dreamed of rivaling. So long as they were bachelors, they lived a communal existence, enlivened by dancing and songs, and by the company of the young women, the awianime, who were officially allowed them as courtesans. Indeed, these two systems of education were so different that from certain points of view they seemed opposed and even hostile. Sahagun, making himself the mouthpiece of the nobles, the former pupils of the Calmecac, says that the young men of the Telpochcali did not lead a good life, for they had mistresses. They presumed to utter light and ironic words, and spoke with pride and temerity. This antagonism showed itself, and burst out with the consent of public opinion in certain circumstances. During the month at Temostli, for example, when the youths of the Calmecac and those of the Telpochcali threw themselves upon one another in mock battles. Underlying This contrast is the contrast between the gods who presided over the two branches of education. The god of the Calmecac was Quetzalcoatl, the priest's own god, and the god of self-sacrifice and penance, of books, the calendar, and the arts, the symbol of abnegation and of culture. The young man's god was Tezcatlipoca, who was also called Telpochtli, the young man, and Yault, the warrior. Quetzalcoatl's old enemy, who had expelled him from the earthly paradise of Tula long ago by his enchantments. To send a boy to the Calmecac was to devote him to Quetzalcoatl. To send him to the Telpochtli was to pledge him to Tezcatlipoca. Beneath the mark of these divine persons, two different concepts of life are set one against the other. On the one hand, there is the priestly ideal of self-denial, the study of the stars and the signs, contemplative knowledge, and chastity. On the other, the ideal of the warriors, with the emphasis deliberately set upon action, battle, the collective life, and the fleeting pleasures of youth. It is by no means the least curious feature of the Aztec civilization that a society so passionately given to war should have chosen the teaching of Quetzalcoatl to mold its rulers, and that it should have left that of Tezcatlipoca to the more numerous but less honored class. A deeper study of this society would no doubt bring to light profound contradictions in which their turn would explain those internal tensions that the community sublimated from time to time by forms of ritual. The origin of these contradictions would have to be sought in the superimposition and the mixture of the differing cultures, that of the Toltecs, passed on by the settled inhabitants of the valley, and that of the nomadic tribes to which the Aztecs had belonged, which together made up the Mexican civilization, as it was at the time of its discovery by the Europeans. Native thought was dominated by dualism, in this case that which set up Quetzalcoatl against Tezcatlipoca, and this dualism is also found in the education itself. However that may be, this education functioned. It prepared governors, priests, warriors, and women who knew their future work. It was only in the Calmecac that what may properly be called intellectual teaching had a considerable place. But there all the knowledge of the time and the country was taught, reading and writing in the pictographic characters, divination, chronology, poetry, and rhetoric. It should also be remembered that these songs, which were learnt by heart, often concerned the history of these cities, of former reigns and wars, and in this way the young people came to know their own past. In the Telpochtli, however, the songs and dances and the music did not provide the future warriors with any excessive load of learning. In a general manner, Mexican education in both its forms helped to produce strength of mind and of body, and a character devoted to the public good. The stoicism with which the Aztecs were able to meet the most terrible ordeals proves that this education attained its end. Lastly, although their system was divided into two markedly distinct branches, it is evident that this separation did not bring into being an impassable barrier against the rise of boys of poor or lowly family, since the highest offices, such that of the Tlacochcalcat, were sometimes held by plebeians who had been at a Telpochtli, and then in their turn, the sons of these promoted plebeians might go to the Calmecac. It is well worth noting that in that age and upon that continent, an American native race practiced compulsory education for all, and that no Mexican child of the 16th century, whatever his social origin, was deprived of schooling. One has but to compare this state of affairs with what is known of our own classical antiquity or Middle Ages to realize the care that the native civilization of Mexico, for all its limitations, devoted to the training of its young people and to the molding of its citizens. Marriage, family life. Once he was 20, a young man might marry, and most Mexicans did between this age and 22. Only the high dignitaries and rulers could live for years with concubines before being officially married. The king of Texcoco, Nezahualcóyotl, was an example of this. Marriage was considered as primarily a matter for the families and by no means for the individuals. At least, this was the traditional view of it. But it is likely that the young people could offer suggestions to their parents, if no more. But before passing from the celibate to the married state, that is, before reaching full adult status, it was necessary to be free of the Kalmakak or the Telpochkali and to gain the consent of those who had been the young man's masters for so many years. This permission was asked for at a banquet given by the young man's family. The Telpochtlatoque were asked to a feast as magnificent as the family's means would allow. There would be tamales, different kinds of ragots, and cocoa. The masters, having relished the dishes, smoked the pipes that they were given. And then, in the happy atmosphere of well-being that comes after a good meal, the young man's father, the elders on the paternal side, and the local counselors brought a polished stone axe with great ceremony, and turning to the masters, addressed them in the following words: "Lords and masters of the young men, here present, do not be wounded if your brother, our son, desires to leave your company. At this time he wishes to take a wife. Behold this axe. It is a sign that this young man is going to leave you, according to the custom of the Mexicans. Take it and set free our son." To this a Telpochtlato replied, "We have all heard, we and the young men with whom your son has been brought up, that you now intend to marry him, and that from now on he will leave us forever. Let it be as you wish it to be." Then the masters took the axe, a symbolic gesture of acquiescence in the young man's withdrawal, and ceremoniously left the house. Of course, everything had been known in advance: the feast, the request, and the reply. But this occasion was ruled, as were so many others, by an Indian love of form and of traditional words and actions. According to Motolinia, the Telpochtlato did not let his pupils go without a homily exhorting them to behave like worthy servants of the gods and not to forget all they had learnt in school. And since they were going to take a wife and set a house, to work like men and feed and maintain their family, he also told them that in time of war they should conduct themselves like brave and courageous soldiers. As for the girls, they too were not left without advice or good teaching, but on the contrary, they were admonished at length, particularly the daughters of the lords and dignitaries. They were told that 3 precepts above all others should guide their lives. They should serve the gods, they should be chaste, and they should love, serve, and look up to their husbands. Although they were heathens, adds the missionary, the Mexicans were not without good customs. When the relatives of the young man had decided upon the choice of his future wife, which was not before they had consulted the soothsayers to know what omens were to be drawn from the signs under which both the parties were born, they then in turn called the Cihuatlanque, the old women who acted as go-betweens, for no advance was to be made directly. These women went to see the girls' parents, and they, with a great deal of rhetoric and fine language, they explained the purpose of their visit. Good manners required that the first time they should be answered with a humble excuse and a civil refusal. The girl was not yet old enough to marry. She was not worthy of the person who asked for her. However, everybody knew how to take this, and the next day or some days later, the matrons came back, and finally the parents went so far as to say, "We do not know how much this young man can have made such a mistake, for our daughter is of no value, and indeed she is rather stupid. But still, seeing that you seem to get so much store by it, but still, seeing that you seem to set so much store by it, we will have to speak to the girls' uncles and aunts and all her other relatives. So come back again tomorrow, and we will settle the matter." When they had their family council, and when all the relatives had given their consent, the girls' parents told the young man's parents, and then there was no more to arrange but the day of the wedding. For this, the soothsayers were consulted again, in order to set the marriage under a favorable sign, such as Akat reed, Osomatli monkey, Sipakli water monster, Guatli eagle, or Gali house. It was also necessary to prepare the dishes, the cocoa, the flowers, and the pipes for the marriage feast. They made tamales all night and all day for 2 or 3 days, and hardly slept at all during the time of getting ready. If the family had the least degree of wealth or the smallest claim to standing, the marriage was a most important business. All the relations and friends were invited, as well as the young man's former masters and the considerable people of the district or the town. The marriage ceremony itself took place at the young man's house at nightfall. The day before there was feasting at the bride's house. At a midday banquet, the old men drank okli, and married women brought their gifts. In the afternoon, the bride had a bath and washed her hair. Her legs and arms were decorated with red feathers, and her face was made up with the light yellow of decosawit. Thus adorned, she sat near the fire on a dais covered with mats, and the elders of the young man's family came to offer her the ceremonial greeting. "My daughter," they said, "you honor us, the old men and old women who are your relations. You are now counted among the women. You are no longer a child. You have started to be a grown-up person. Poor child! You must leave your father and your mother. Daughter, we welcome you and wish you happiness." One can imagine the bride, decorated with feathers and flowers, made up, dressed in many colored embroideries, moved and somewhat trembling, though accustomed by her education to hide her feelings, compelling herself to be calm as she answered, "Your hearts have been good to me. I feel that the words you have spoken are precious. You have spoken to me and advised me like true fathers and mothers. I am grateful for all the kindness that you have shown me." At night, a procession conducted the bride to her new home. The young man's relations went in front. Many respectable old women and matrons then came to the bride. An old woman carried her on her back, or if she were of a good family, it was in a litter that she went to her new house on the shoulders of two porters. She was accompanied by two lines of girls, relations, and unmarried friends, holding torches in their hands. The happy procession would sing along these streets amid songs and shouts, and through the crowds of onlookers who cried out, "Happy girl," until it reached the bridegroom's house. He came forward to receive her. In his hand he had a censer, and when the bride reached the threshold, she was given another. As a sign of mutual respect, each censed the other, and everybody went into the house, singing and dancing. The marriage rite took place between the hearth. To begin with, two young people, seated beside one another to mats, were given their presents. The bride's mother gave her future son-in-law men's clothes. The bridegroom's mother gave the bride a blouse and a skirt. Then the siwatlanke tied the young man's cloak and the young girl's blouse together, and from that moment they were married. The first thing that they did was to share a dish of tamales, each giving the other the little maize cakes by hand. At this stage, the happiness of the wedding party broke out into songs and dances. Then the guests set upon the heaps of food, and those whose age allowed them became exceedingly drunk. The married pair, however, who had gone off to the marriage chamber, stayed there in prayer for 4 days, without consummating their marriage. During all this time they did not come out of their room except to offer incense at the family altar at noon and at midnight. On the 4th night there was a bed made for them, a pile of mats, along which were placed feathers and a piece of jade. These were probably symbols of the children who were to be born, they always being called rich plumes and precious stones. On the 5th day, they bathed themselves in the Damaskali, and a priest came by to bless them by scattering a little consecrated water over them. In great families, the ceremony of the 5th day was almost as elaborate as that of the marriage itself. The relatives blessed the newly wedded pair 4 times with water and 4 times with okli. The bride adorned her head with white feathers and her arms and legs with colored plumes. There was another exchange of presents, and at another banquet the two families and their friends had another opportunity of dancing, singing, and drinking. Among the plebeians, these festivities were quieter and less costly, but their general plan was the same as that which has just been described. This, at any rate, was the ideal that everybody tried to accomplish. Yet in practice, it happened that amorous young couples did not ask their parents' consent, but went off together privately. It seems that these were usually plebeians who did not want to have to wait until they had accumulated all the things that were necessary for the presents, the feasts, etc. At the end of a certain time, when he had saved up enough to invite their families, the young man went to see his wife's parents and said, "I admit my fault. We were wrong to be joined without your consent. You must have been quite astonished not to see your daughter any more. But we both agreed to live together like married people, and now we would like to live properly and work for ourselves and our children. Forgive us and give us your consent." The parents agreed, and then they went through these ceremonies and what festivities their poor means would allow. It was in this manner, and according to these rites, that a man married his principal wife, and he could only marry in this way with one woman, but he could have as many secondary wives as he liked. The Mexican marriage system seems to be a compromise between monogamy and polygamy. One legitimate spouse, this is the term generally used by the chroniclers. She with whom a man was married with all the ceremonies that have been described, but an indefinite number of officially recognized concubines who had their place in the house, and whose status was in no way the subject of sniggering or contempt. The historian Oviedo recounts a conversation that he says he had with the Spaniard Juan Cano, the third husband of Doña Isabel Montezuma, the daughter of Emperor Moctezuma II, as follows. Question: I have been told that Montezuma had 150 sons and daughters. How can you maintain that Doña Isabel, your wife, is a legitimate daughter of Montezuma? And how did your father-in-law manage to tell his legitimate children from the bastards, and his real wives from the concubines? Answer of Don Juan Cano. The Mexicans observed the following custom when they married a legitimate wife. They took the flap of the bride's blouse and tied it with the cotton cloak that the bridegroom wore. And those who were married without this ceremony were not held to be really married, and the children born of the union were not considered legitimate and did not inherit. The Aztec chronicler Pomar states, "The king of Texcoco had as many wives as he chose, and of every kind of descent, high or low, but only one legitimate wife among them all." The texts are unanimous upon this point. For example, Isli Xochitl says that the custom of the rulers was to have one legitimate wife who could be the mother of their successor. The anonymous conquistador also says that the Indians have many wives, as many as they can feed like the Moors, but there is one who is above all the others and whose children inherit to the detriment of their half-brothers. Muñoz Camargo states that the legitimate wife gave orders to her husband's concubines, and indeed that it was she who adorned and beautified the one whom her husband chose, in order to sleep with her. There is no doubt that the half-barbarous tribes which came from the north were monogamous, as all the descriptions of their manner of life demonstrate. Polygamy must have remained customary among the settled inhabitants, the former Toltecs of the Central Valley, and as the standard of living rose, it became more and more usual, particularly in the ruling class and among the sovereigns. The latter numbered their secondary wives by the hundreds or by thousands, and Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco had more than 2,000. And there was an established custom of ratifying the alliances between cities by the exchange of wives of the various dynasties. One should not be led astray by the expressions legitimate and illegitimate, which were used after the Spanish conquest because of the influence of European ideas. The condition of the secondary wives and of their children was in no way a shameful one. Perhaps in theory only the sons of the principal wife succeeded, but the authorities abound in examples to the contrary. One has but to mention the most famous of them all, that of the Emperor Itzcoatl, who was the son of a concubine of the most humble origin. In any case, the children of secondary wives were always considered bili, and if they were worthy of them, they could reach the highest offices in the state. It would be totally erroneous to think of them as natural children or bastards, with the connotations that these words have in our world. Yet if in theory the polygamous family was accepted without question, in fact the jealousy between a man's wives and the rivalry between their children caused a very great deal of trouble. Sometimes the concubines would plot to sow discord between the husband and his children by the principal wife. It was in this way that a favorite of King Nezahualcóyotl succeeded in bringing disaster upon the head of the young prince Tetzaltli, the wonderful child. Tetzaltli, the son of the king and his chief wife, rejoiced in all the gifts that nature can bestow upon an illustrious prince. He had an excellent disposition, and although his tutors and masters never had to take pains with him because he became a widely accomplished person, a considerable philosopher, a poet, and a soldier of the first order, and was even deeply versed in nearly all the mechanical arts. Another prince, the son of the king and a concubine, carved a precious stone in the form of a bird in so lifelike a manner that the bird seemed to be living, and he gave this jewel as a present to his father. His father was delighted with the aspect of the jewel, and he wished it to be given to his son Tetsa Belzintli, for he loved him exceedingly. Who could have believed that this charming family scene could develop into a tragedy? This, however, was the case, for the concubine's son, following his mother's counsels, went to the king and told him that the prince had made a most ungracious reply, which made him suspect that he meant to revolt against his father, that he had said that he did not care for the mechanical arts which preoccupied the prince who had carved the jewel, but only for military affairs, and that he was determined to rule the world, and, if possible, to become a greater man than his father, and that while he spoke in this way, he had showed his half-brother an arsenal filled with weapons. The king was very much moved at this news, and sent a confidential servant to visit his son, and in fact the messenger observed that the palace would have been given to the prince had its walls covered with arms. Nezahualcóyotl consulted with his allies, the ruler of Mexico and Tlacopan, and begged them to see his son and to reproach him, so that he might return to his duty. But the other two monarchs, who were perhaps not at all sorry to weaken the neighboring dynasty, went to the prince's palace under the pretense of visiting him to see some building that he was having done, and certain officers who accompanied them, feigning to put a garland of flowers around his neck, strangled him. When the king heard of the death of the prince, whom he loved dearly, he wept bitterly, bewailing the hardness of two kings' hearts. For several days he stayed in the woods, sad and afflicted, lamenting his unhappiness, for he had no other legitimate son to succeed him at the head of the kingdom, although by his concubines he had 60 sons and 57 daughters. Most of the sons had become famous soldiers, and the daughters had married lords of his court, or else of Mexico and Tlacopan, and to all these he had given many estates, villages, and lands. It seemed that the royal house of Texcoco was marked out for a tragic fate. Nezahualpili, Nezahualcóyotl's successor, was also responsible for his own son's death. Huaxonzincatzin, his eldest son, was an outstanding philosopher and poet, as well having other gifts and natural graces, and so he composed a satire addressed to the Lady of Tula, his father's favorite concubine. She too was an excellent poet, and they took to exchanging poetic blows. The prince was suspected of making advances to the favorite. The matter was brought before the court, and, as according to the law, it was a case of treason towards the king, which carried out the death penalty. It was necessary to carry this sentence, although his father loved him beyond measure. In passing, it may be noticed that this palace drama was one of the remote causes of the fall of the Mexican Empire. For Nezahualpili's heir dying in these circumstances, the succession to the throne of Texcoco was furiously disputed by several of his half-brothers, and one of them, Ixtlilxóchitl, went over to the Spanish side with his supporters and his army. This Lady of Tula, who was perhaps against her will the cause of the tragic death of Huaxonzincatzin, may be held up as a finished type of the Mexican magnate's favorite. Although she was only the daughter of a person engaged in commerce, she was as cultivated as she was beautiful. She could compete with the king and the great men in knowledge and poetry. She had a kind of private court, and she lived in a palace that had been built for her, and she kept the king very submissive to her will. It appears that all these wives, principal and secondary, had a great many children, and the polygamous families became exceedingly numerous. Nezahualpili had 140 sons and daughters, of whom 11 were by his chief wife. The Crónica Mexicayot lists 22 children of Axayacat, 20 of Ahuitzotl, and 19 of Motecuzoma. The Cihuacoat Tlacaeleltzin, a great imperial dignity under Motecuzoma I, first married a noblewoman, a girl from Amecameca, by whom he had 5 children. Then 12 secondary wives, each of whom he had a son or a daughter. But, as the text, other Mexicans say that the elder Tlacaeleltzin, the Cihuacoat, begot 83 children, Clearly, only dignitaries and wealthy men could contend with the expense of families such as these. Even though it was limited to the upper strata, polygamy hastened the progress of demographic evolution and helped to compensate the effects of frequent war. Many men died on the battlefield or as sacrifices before they have been able to marry, or in any case, before they had the time to beget many children. In the lists of names that are to be found in some chronicles, the annotations killed in fighting against Huachotzingo, or killed at the Battle of Atlixco, continually recur, like a funeral leitmotif. The widows could either stay by themselves and then remarry, and it often happened that a widow married one of her husband's slaves and made him her steward, or else become a secondary wife to one of the dead man's brothers. The man was the unquestioned head of the family, and the atmosphere of the family was decidedly patriarchal. He was supposed to treat all his wives as equals, but a bad husband would sometimes make one of them, particularly the principal wife, undergo all kinds of miseries. Public opinion was very much against this. Moquihuitli, the ruler of Tlatelolco, had married a sister of the Mexican Emperor Axayacat, the Princess Chalchiu Nenetzi. But apart from the fact that her breath smelt, she was skinny and she had no flesh, and because of this her husband never wished to see her. He took all the presents that her brother Axayacat sent her and gave them to his secondary wives. The Princess Chalchiu Nenetzi suffered much. She was made to sleep in a corner against the wall by the metlat, and she only had a coarse cloak to cover herself with, and that all in rags. And King Moquihuitli would not sleep with her. He spent his nights only with his concubines, very lovely women, for the noble Chalchiu Nenetzi was but a meager creature. She had no flesh, and her bosom was no more than bone. So Moquihuitli did not love her, and he used her ill. All this became to be known, and the Emperor Axayacat grew furious. It was for this reason that the war between Mexico and Tlatelolco began, and this is how it can be said that Tlatelolco perished because of the concubines. Nevertheless, the Mexican woman must not be thought of as a kind of perpetual minor. Although she lived in a society dominated by men, she was by no means as subjugated as might be supposed at first. In former times, women had held the supreme power, as at Tula, for example, and it even appears that a woman, Ilan Cueit, was at the origin of the royal power in Mexico. At least in the beginning, the royal blood ran through the female side, and Ilan Cueit, or Ilan Cueit, rather, brought the Toltec lineage of Colhuacan to Mexico, thus allowing the Aztec dynasty to lay claim to descent from the famous line of Quetzalcoatl. At a later period, there is an example of a plebeian of the humblest origin becoming a Tlatoani of a province because of his marriage with a daughter of the Emperor Itzcoatl. There is no doubt that as time went on, the power of the men grew greater, and that there was a continually increasing tendency to shut the women up between the four walls of the house. But she retained her own property, and she could do business, entrusting her goods to itinerant traders, or exercise certain professions, such as those of priestess, midwife, or healer, in which she enjoyed a high degree of independence. The profession of the alhuanime, whom the Spanish chroniclers tend to treat as whores, although at the same time they state that they gave their bodies for nothing, was not only recognized but valued. They had their own place reserved for them, beside the young warriors whose companions they were in the ceremonies of religion. Some customs betray a certain antagonism between the sexes. Sometimes it was the boys and the young men who attacked the women in the street with pillows, occasionally getting more than they bargained for in return, and sometimes it was the girls who jeered at the uncouth young warriors and insulted them bitterly. During the festivities of the month Huitosotli, the girls went into procession, with their faces painted and their arms and legs decorated with feathers, carrying the consecrated ears of maize, and if a boy ventured to say anything to them, they would turn on him, shouting, "Really, here is a long-haired creature, that is, one who has not yet been in battle, that is talking. But what have you got to say? You had better go and do something so that you can have your hair cut, Harry. Or perhaps you are really only a woman like me. Then the boys would try to put a good face on it by replying with an assumed coarseness, Go and cover your belly with mud. Go and drag yourself about in the dust. But among themselves, the discomfited young men would say, The words of the women are piercing and cruel. They wound our hearts. Let us go and volunteer for the war. Perhaps then, my friends, we shall have a reward. The old women who had outlived the time when they had to be submissive to their husbands, or who had outlived the husbands, had a great deal of independence. They were much respected, and like the old men, they were allowed to drink their oak leaf from time to time. In reading the texts, one sees them hurrying to help their daughters or their relations, or devoutly attending the innumerable ceremonies in which they had a part to play. They were matrons and they were matchmakers, and they were always there when there was a family feast, at which they would have their place at the table and the right to make long speeches. In a country in which age itself confers privileges, an old woman is among those whose advice is asked for and listened to, even if it is only by those of her immediate neighborhood. The Mexican woman, during her life as a wife and a mother, or from about her 20th year to her 50th, had a great deal to do. Perhaps the king's favorites could cultivate poetry, but the ordinary Indian woman, with her children, her cooking, her weaving, and the countless duties of a housewife, had little time to spare. In the country, she also shared in the work on the land, and even in the towns she looked after the poultry. It is difficult to say whether there was very much adultery. The extremely rigorous repression and the frequent references to the execution of adulterers in literature seem to show that the community was aware of a serious danger and that it reacted violently against it, in something of the same manner that it did against drunkenness. The punishment was death for both. They were killed by having their heads crushed by a stone. The women, however, were strangled first. Not even the highest dignitaries could escape this punishment. But although the law was so severe, it insisted that the crime should be thoroughly proved, and the testimony of the husband alone counted for nothing. Impartial witnesses were necessary to confirm his evidence, and the husband who killed his wife, even if he found her in the very act, was also liable to the death penalty. Perhaps the best known and most dramatic example of adultery in the history of ancient Mexico also comes from the chronicles of the royal house of Texcoco. Among the secondary wives of King Nezahualcóyotl was a daughter of Axayácatl, the Aztec emperor. This princess, although she was little more than a child, was so vicious and so devilish that if she found herself alone in her apartments and surrounded by those who served her. Elsewhere, Ixtlilxóchitl says that there were no fewer than 2,000 of them, and who, because of the splendor of her name, respected her, she would indulge in 1,000 extravagances. This reached such a point that if she saw a handsome and well-shaped young man whose form agreed with her tastes and inclinations, she would give secret orders that he should enjoy her charms. When she had satisfied her desires, she would have him killed and a statue made in his likeness. She would adorn this statue with gorgeous clothes and jewels of gold and precious stones, and she would have it put in the room in which she usually passed her time. There were enough of these statues to go almost round the walls. When the king went to see her and asked her what these statues were for, she replied that they were her gods. For his part, he believed her, knowing how religious the Mexicans were, and how deeply attached to their false gods. But something happened to betray the Aztec princess's secret. She was so imprudent as to give one of her lovers, he still being alive, a jewel that her husband had given her. Nezahualcóyotl, filled with suspicion, arrived one night at the young woman's apartments. The women and the servants told him that she was asleep, hoping that the king would go away, as he had done before. But distrusting them, he went into the bedroom to awake her. He found nothing there but a statue, stretched on the bed and crowned with a wig. During this time the princess was making merry with 3 young men of excellent family. All 4 were condemned to death and executed, as well as a great number of her accomplices in adultery and assassination, in the presence of an immense crowd. These events contributed not a little towards the embittering of the relations between the House of Texcoco and the imperial family of Mexico, which, although it hid its resentment, never forgave the allied king for the punishment that the Aztec princess had suffered. There was little question of divorce in ancient Mexico. Desertion of the conjugal domicile by either the husband or wife constituted grounds for the dissolution of the marriage. The courts could authorize a man to repudiate his wife if he proved that she was sterile or unconscionably neglectful of her household duties. On her side, the wife could complain against her husband and have judgment in her favor if he were convicted of beating her, for example, or of not maintaining her, or of abandoning the children. In this case, the court gave her custody of the children, and the conjugal property was equally divided between the two former spouses. This divorced woman was free to marry again whenever she chose. Marriage, whether it was calm or troubled, marked the entry of the Mexican into adult society. From the time that the young people were married, and they were registered with the other households, and although the country was full of people, and indeed overflowed with them, they were all taken into account. A married man had a right to a piece of the land that belonged to his capuli, and to the occasional distributions of victuals or clothes. He was a fully privileged citizen, and the reputation that he had in his neighborhood depended largely upon the decency of his family life and the care with which he brought up his children. There is no doubt that the Mexicans, behind the stiff formalism of their family relationships, loved their children tenderly. No pilce, no cusque, no quetzale, sweet son, my jewel, my precious feather. This is a father speaking to his boy. When a woman was pregnant, the news was a matter for great joy in both the families, and for festivities to which the relations and the great men of the neighborhood or the village were invited. After a banquet, and while the guests smoked their pipes, an elder would speak in the name of the future father. In addressing the important men, he would say, "Relations and my lords, I would like to say a few boorish and clumsy words, since you have all come together here by the will of our god Yoali Eekat, the night wind, Tezcatlipoca, who is in all places. It is he who has given you life up to this time, to you who are our shelter and our protection, you who are like the pochot, which gives so much shade, and the awet, which shelters and animals under its branches. In the same way you, my lords, you are the protector and the preservers of the small and humble people who dwell in the mountains and upon the plains. You look after the poor soldiers and warlike men, you who look upon you as their prop and their comfort. No doubt you have your anxieties and cares, and that we cause you pain and distress. Listen, my lords who are here, and all of you old men and old women with whitened heads. You must know that our God in his mercy has granted, here the name of the pregnant woman, recently married, a precious stone, a splendid feather." The orator still had a long course to run, in which he would call dead forebears to memory, who are at rest in the caves, in the waters, in the underworld. Then, in succession, would come a second orator, in the names of the relatives. Then one of the important guests, who would address himself particularly to the young woman, comparing her to a piece of jade and to a sapphire, and reminding her that the life that she carried within her came from the holy pair Ometecutli, Omestiwada. Then the young woman's father and mother, and lastly she herself, to thank those who had come and to ask whether she deserved the happiness of having a child. In the words that she was to say, in the conventional phrases, one detects that uncertain note, that anxiety in the face of what is to come, which sounds so often in the expression of the Aztec mind. A pregnant woman was under the protection of the goddesses of fertility and of health, of Tatel-Inan, the mother of the gods, patroness of the midwives, who was also called Temazcaltequi, or Temazcaltesi, the grandmother of the steam bath, and of Ayopeshli or Ayopeshkat, the little feminine deity of childbed. We know the text of a prayer, a true magical formula, which was sung to invoke the last name goddess. Down there where Ayopeshkat lives, the jewel is born. A child has come into our world. Down there where Bechkat lives, the jewel is born, a child has come into the world. It is down there in her own place that the children are born. Come, come here, newborn child, come here. Come here, jewel child, come here. For a long time before the birth of a child, the young woman, at least in the better sort of families, received attentive care. A midwife was chosen for her, and the old relations went to engage her, with great ceremony, to look after the future mother. As soon as she had agreed, though, not without first objecting that she was only an unfortunate, stupid, unintelligent old woman, the midwife went to her patient's house and lit the fire for a steam bath. She and the young woman went into the temazcali, taking great care that the bath was not too hot, and she palpated her client's belly to find out how the baby lay. Then she gave her advice. The woman was to abstain from chewing sickly, for fear that the baby's palate and gums should swell, which would prevent it from feeding. She was neither to let herself grow angry nor to be frightened, and the household was told to give her anything that she longed for. If she were to look at red objects, the child would be born askew. If she went out at night, she was to put a little ash in her blouse or her belt, otherwise she might be terrified by ghosts. If she were to look at the sky during an eclipse, the child would be born with a hare lip, unless the mother had taken the precaution of carrying an obsidian knife under her clothes against the skin. It was also said that if the father, going out at night, were to see a phantom, the child would have a heart disease. In short, a whole network of prohibitions and traditional precepts surrounded the mother during the entire period before birth, and even the father too, in order, as they thought, to protect their child. The midwife alone had the management of the lying in. She took charge of the household, prepared the food in the baths, and massaged the patient's belly. If the birth was delayed, the woman was given a drop made from siwapatli, Montanoa tomentosa, which, taken as an infusion, causes strong contractions. If this did not answer, then they turned to the last resort, a drink made of water in which a piece of the tail of a tlacuatzin or opossum had been mixed. This brew was thought to bring about an immediate and even violent delivery. If baths, massage, and medicines had no effect, the midwife shut herself into a room with the patient. She invoked the goddesses, particularly Siwakwat and Quilatzli. If she saw that the child was dead within its mother, she took a flint knife and cut the fetus to pieces. It was clearly understood that a woman who died in childbirth was upon the same footing as a warrior who died in battle or as a sacrifice. After her death, her body was cleaned. Her head and her hair were washed with soap, and they dressed her in the best new clothes. And her husband carried her on his back to the place where she was to be buried. The dead woman's hair was left loose and untied. All the midwives and the old women gathered to go with the body. They carried shields and swords, and as they went, they made the cries of warriors about to attack. The young men called Telpopochti, these were the inmates of the Telpochcali, came out to meet them and struggled to take the woman's body away from them. The dead woman was buried at sunset in the courtyard of the temple dedicated to the goddesses called the Heavenly Woman or Siwapipilti Princess, and her husband and her friends guarded her 4 nights running to prevent anybody from stealing the body. The young warriors watched to see if they might steal it, for they considered it as something holy or divine, and if, in fighting with the midwives, they succeeded in getting it, then at once, and in front of these very women, they would cut off the middle finger of the left hand. And if they could steal the corpse by night, they would cut off this same finger and the hair and keep them as relics. The reason why the warriors tried to take the finger and the hair of the dead woman was this. When they went to war, they put this hair or this finger in their shields, and they said that because of it, they would be brave and valiant, that the hair and the finger would give them strength, and that they blinded the eyes of their enemies. It was said that the woman, dead in childbed, did not go to the underworld but into the palace of the sun, and that the sun took her with him because of her courage. The women who are killed in war or who die at their first lying in are called Mosiwaketske, valiant women, and they are numbered among those who die in battle. They all go to the sun, and they live in the western part of the heavens, and that is why the old people called the Occident Ciutlampa, the women's side. The women welcomed the sun at the zenith and went down with him as far as the west, carrying him on a litter made of quetzal plumes. They marched before him, shouting with joy, fighting, making much of him. They left him in the palace where the sun goes down, and there those of the lower world came to receive him. The destiny of the valiant women in the hereafter was therefore exactly the equivalent, the counterpart, of that of the warriors who died in battle or upon the sacrificial stone. The warriors accompanied the sun from its rising to its height, and the women from the zenith to its setting. The women had become goddesses, and therefore they were called the Siwatateo, the divine women. Their sufferings and their death earned them apotheosis. They were the formidable deities of the twilight, and on certain nights they appeared at the crossroads and struck those that met them with paralysis. They were identified both with the occidental goddesses of Tamuanchan, the western paradise, and with the monsters of the end of the world. Sickness and old age. The ancient Mexicans' ideas on sickness and medicine in their practices were an inextricable mixture of religion, magic, and science. There was a religion for certain deities who were held either to send illnesses or to heal them. There was magic, for generally the illness was attributed to the black magic of some sorcerer, and it was by magic that the remedy was sought. And there was science, for Aztec medicine has, in some respects, a curiously modern appearance, with its knowledge of the properties of plants and minerals and the use of bleeding and of baths. There is no doubt, however, that of these three factors, the first two were by far the most important, and of these two, magic predominated over religion. The physician or tisite, either man or woman, was above all a sorcerer, but a benign sorcerer, accepted and approved by the community, whereas the caster of spells, the black magician, was condemned. Among the Nahua Indians of the present day in the Sierra de Orizaba, sickness is attributed to four possible causes: the introduction of a foreign body into the person of the sufferer by black magic, injuries or death inflicted upon the sufferer's totem, his animal double or nawali, by an enemy or a malignant wizard, the loss of the tonali, a term which is used for the soul and the vital breath, as well as the sign under which the patient was born and thus his fate or destiny, and lastly the heirs. In Spanish, heirs, and in Nahua, ehecat cocolitzle, heirs of sickness. The invisible and baleful influences that float about mankind, particularly at night. These ideas descend directly from those which were current in the days before the Spaniards came. The belief in the introduction of a foreign body by magic to cause illness was very widely spread, and the healing women were called the Tetlaquiquiliche, they who draw out stones from the body, Tetlanoquilanque, those who draw out worms from the teeth, and Teishoquilanque, those who draw out worms from the eyes. Although the Nahuatl expression in its present tense is probably a recent usage, formerly the term tonali embraced the genius peculiar to each person, his good fortune, and his star in the sense of his predestination. As to the malignant errors, they were formerly thought to originate with Tlaloc and Tlaloque, the mountain gods. They, the Indians, believed that certain illnesses, which seemed to be those which are caused by the cold, came from the mountains, or that these mountains had the power of healing them. Those who had these diseases made a vow to offer a feast or a sacrifice to some particular mountain in their neighborhood, or for which they felt a special devotion. Those who were in danger of death by drowning in the rivers or the sea made the same kind of vow. The diseases for which these vows were made were gouts in the hands of the feet, or of any other part of the body, palsy in a limb or the whole body, swelling of the neck or of some other part of the body, the withering of a limb or general stiffness. Those who were afflicted with these illnesses vowed to make images of the god of the wind, of the goddesses of the water, and the god of the rain. Skin diseases, ulcers, leprosy, and dropsy were also attributed to Tlaloc. Convulsions and infantile paralysis were thought to come from those Siwa Pipitin who were mentioned earlier. These goddesses go about in the air together, and when they choose to appear to those who live upon the earth, and they strike boys and girls with sickness by paralyzing them and by getting into human bodies. The present belief in the errors is only the same tradition in an impersonal form. Other deities, Tlazolteotl and her companions, who presided over carnal love, could also cause disease. It was believed that the man or women who indulged in forbidden love spread about them, like a lasting evil spell, that which was called Tlazomiquitzli, the death caused by the lust, and that because of this their children and relatives were afflicted with melancholy and consumption. It was like an uncleanliness that was both physical and moral, and one could only be cured by the steam bath, the rite of purification, and by calling upon the Tlazolteotl, the goddess of love and desire. The god of youth, music, and flowers, Xochipilli, who was also called Maquixochitl, punished those who did not obey prohibitions, men and women who lay together during fasts, for example, by sending them venereal diseases, piles, and skin diseases. Xipetotec was thought to be responsible for eye diseases. If some gods caused sickness, others, or the same, could heal. The Tlaloque and Xochipilli might answer prayers and sacrifices and take away the maladies that they had sent. The fire god helped women in labor, as did the goddess Siwakwat also, who looked after those who took steam baths. Another goddess, Tzapotlatenan, cured ulcers or eruptions on the scalp, chaps, and hoarseness, and a little black-faced god, Ixtliton, healed children. In his temple, there were closed pots that held what was called in his black water, Ixtlilau. When a child fell sick, it was taken to the temple of Ixtliton. A jar was opened, the child was made to drink some of the black water, and it was cured. When an Indian became unwell, the first thing to do was to find a reason for his illness, and the diagnosis was made by divination, not by any observation of his symptoms. To do this, the physician threw maize upon a piece of cloth or into a vase full of water, and he drew his conclusions from the manner in which the grains fell, in groups or separately, or how they floated or sank to the bottom. To know whether a sick child had lost its tonali, the healing woman held it over a vessel filled with water and looked into it as a mirror, while she called upon the water goddess, Tlacuel, the Shiwala, the Tla Shiwalau, Nonan Chalchiwe, Chalchiutli Ikwe, Chalchiutli Iwipil, Shoshoyuki Yukwe, Shoshoyuki Iwipil, Itztakiwato. Listen, come, you my mother, stone of jade, you who have a jade skirt, you who have a jade blouse, green skirt, green blouse, white woman. If the child's face seemed darkened in the water mirror, as if it were covered in a shadow, it must mean that its tonali had been stolen. In other cases, the Disi turned to a holy plant called Ololiuki, whose seed produced a kind of intoxication and in visions. Sometimes peyote or tobacco was used, being taken either by the doctor or the patient, or by a third person. The hallucinations that these plants induced were thought to bring revelations as to the cause of the disease, that is to say, as to the magic which caused it, and the identity of the sorcerer. A man's denunciations by these oracles was never questioned, and from this cause arose much bitterness and many undying hatreds between the families of the sick people and the alleged sorcerers. Then there were other forms of diagnostic magic in use. The divination by strings, which was the specialty of the Mecatlapoque, fortune tellers by the strings, and the measurement of the arm, a rite in which the healer, having rubbed his hands with tobacco, measured the left arm of the patient with the palm of his right hand. Once the nature and the case of the malady had been decided, the treatment began. If it were an illness sent by a god, they tried to appease him with offerings. In other cases, the treatment including magical operations to a greater or a less degree, invocations, insufflations, laying on of hands, drawing out of stones, worms, or pieces of paper that were supposed to have been put into the patient's body, and medical treatment based upon positive knowledge, bleeding, baths, purges, dressings, plasters, and the giving extracts or infusions of plants. Tobacco and vegetable incense, copali, played a great part in all these practices. The tobacco was spoken to, as it was crushed or ground, and it was called he who has been struck 9 times. The healer's fingers were termed the 5 tonali, and generally speaking, the language used in these magic formulae was very figurative and obscure. For example, this was the way in which a headache was treated. The deceased firmly massaged the patient's head and said, "You, the 5 tonali who all look in the same direction, and you, the goddesses Quato and Kashok, who is the Kasoch rather, who is the powerful and venerable being who was destroying our Masewali. It is I who speak, I the priest, I the lord of spells. We will find him at the edge of the sacred water, the sea, and we will throw him into the sacred water." Saying these words, he pressed the patient's temples between his hands and blew on his head. Then he invoked the water in these terms: Listen to me, mother, you who have a jade skirt. Come here and give back his life to this Masewali, our god servant. As he spoke, he spread water over the patient's face and head. If this treatment did not answer, and if the head swelled, the healer applied tobacco mixed with a root called chalalatli, at the same time making this incantation: I the priest, I the lord of spells, I ask, where is he who is destroying this bewitched head? Come, you who have been struck 9 times and crushed 9 times tobacco, and we will cure this bewitched head with the red medicine, the root chalalatli. I call the cold wind that he may cure this bewitched head. O wind, I say to you, do you bring the cure for this bewitched head? When the sickness was in a man's chest, they gave him a maize porridge mixed with the bark of guanapili, passion flower, and laid hands on him, saying, Come, you the 5 tonali, I the priest, I the lord of spells, I seek the green pain, the tawny pain. Where is it hidden? Enchanted medicine, I say to you, I the lord of spells, that I wish to heal this sick flesh. So you must go into the 7 caves, the lungs. Do not touch the yellow heart, enchanted medicine. I expel from this place the green pain, the tawny pain. Come, you the 9 winds, expel the green pain, the tawny pain. At the same time as these invocations and magic gestures, the Mexican physicians understood the use of treatment founded upon a certain knowledge of the human body, a knowledge that was no doubt quite widely spread in a country with such frequent human sacrifices, and of the properties of plants and minerals. They reduced fractures and they splinted broken limbs. They were clever at bleeding patients with obsidian lancets. They put softening plasters upon abscesses and finely ground obsidian upon wounds. Ground like flour, this stone spread on recent wounds and sores heals them very quickly. Their pharmacopoeia included certain minerals, the flesh of certain animals, and above all, a very great number of plants. The good Father Sahagún goes so far as to warrant the virtues of some stones. There are also, he writes, certain stones called etztet, bloodstones, which have the power of stopping bleeding from the nose. I have tried the virtue of this stone myself, for I have a piece of it the size of a fist or a little less. And in that year of 1576, during the epidemic, I revived many people who were losing their blood and their lives through their nostrils. It was enough to take it in one's hand and to hold it for some moments, to stop the bleeding, and the patients were cured of this disease which killed and still does kill so many in New Spain. And there are many witnesses of these facts in the town of Santiago Tlatelolco. The same historian reports that a certain stone called Cuyahuteocuitlat, gold of rain, is good for those who are terrified by a thunderclap, and also for those who have an inward heat or fever. This stone is found in the neighborhood of Jalapa, Ixtepec, and Tlatlauquitepec, and the natives of these parts say that when it begins to thunder and rain in the mountains, these stones fall from the clouds, plunge into the earth, and so grow year by year. And the Indians look for them. They dig the ground and bring out these stones. It is certain that fantastic properties were attributed to stones, to animals. The opossum's tail has already been mentioned, for example, and to plants. But it is equally certain that the Indians have been able to amass a considerable amount of positive experimental knowledge of the plants of their country in the course of time. In this respect, if their medicine is compared with that which raged in Western Europe at the same period, it may be asked whether that of the Aztecs were not the more scientific. Apart from the magical trappings that the Mexican deceit assumed, there was without any doubt more true science in their usage of medicinal plants than in the prescriptions of the European diaphorists of that time. The conquistadores were certainly much impressed by the efficacy of some of the native medicines. In 1570, Philip II of Spain sent his doctor, Francisco Hernandez, to Mexico, and he, in 7 years of strenuous labor, spent the vast sum for that age of 60,000 ducats, brought together a considerable body of information upon the medicinal plants of the country, and collected a magnificent herbal. Unfortunately, he died before he could publish his work, and part of his manuscripts was destroyed in the burning of the Escurial in 1671. Nevertheless, large extracts were published in Mexico and Italy, and they give an idea of the extraordinary wealth of the Mexican materia medica in the 16th century. Hernandez enumerated no less than some 1,200 plants used in medicinal treatment. Sahagún devotes much of his 11th book to herbs and healing plants, and modern research has shown that, in many cases, the Aztec physicians had very accurately, though empirically, distinguished the properties of the plants which they used as purges, emetics, diuretics, sedatives, febrifuges, etc. Among others that may be mentioned, Peruvian balm, jalap, sarsaparilla, istacpatli, sorrelella, pentalafila elm, which was successfully used against fever, chichiquiyawit, gara larifolia hartwa, effective against dysentery, itztacoanenepili, a diuretic, nishtamalasochid, a counter-irritant, valerian, which they use as an antispasmodic, and matlalistic, Commelina pallida, an anti-hemorrhagic. But the field is still largely unexplored, and there is a great deal that remains to be done in the way of identifying the countless species mentioned in the texts and verifying their curative properties. The Mexican who managed to escape death from war and from illness and from doctors, and who reached a sufficiently advanced age to be counted among the Huehuetque, the elders who played so important a part in family and political life, could look forward to a peaceable and honored existence in his last years. If he had served the state as a soldier or as an official, he would be a pensioner, and as such he would receive his lodging and his maintenance. Even if he were only a simple masewali, he would take his place in the local council. If he could speak at all, he could indulge himself in magniloquent harangues upon all these occasions, and there were many, when custom and etiquette required them. Respected by all, he would admonish, advise, and warn. He could at last allow himself, at banquets and family meals, to indulge fearlessly in ocli, even to the point of inebriation, with the men and women of his own generation. Death approached. In preparing themselves for it, those who had committed some grave crime, some hidden sin, such as adultery, during their lives, thought of confession. The effect of confession was not only the absolution of the sinner, it also removed him from the reach of the law. But confession could only happen once in a lifetime, and so most people never call for a confessor until as late as possible. Two deities presided over confession: Tezcatlipoca, because he saw everything, being invisible and omnipresent, and Tlazoteotl, the goddess of lechery and unlawful love, who was also called Tlatecuani, she who eats filth, sin, and thus she who gives absolution. She was called Tlaocuani because the penitent confessed to her and set out all his sins before her. He told her, and he spread out before her eyes all his unclean doings, however grave and ugly, without hiding anything, even out of shame. When a man confessed before her, everything was shown. It was Tlazoteotl who inspired the most vicious desires, and in the same way it was she who forgave them. She took away the defilement, she cleaned, she washed, and she forgave. The penitent told a Tlapuki, skilled in the reading of the interpretation of these sacred books, of his wish to confess, and the priest, consulting his books, fixed upon an auspicious date. If the penitent were a man of importance, the confession would take place at his house. If not, he would attend the priest upon the given day. The two of them sat on new mats beside a fire. The Polki threw incense into the flames, and while the aromatic smoke spread about the room, he called upon the gods, Mother of the gods, Father of the gods, O you, O God, the fire. Behold, a poor man has come. He has come weeping, sad and anxious. Perhaps he has sinned. Perhaps, self-deluded, he has lived unchastely. He comes with a heavy heart, full of sorrow. Lord, our Master, you who are near and who are far, make his trouble cease, pacify his heart. Then, addressing all the penitent, he exhorted him to confess sincerely, to open all his secrets, not to be restrained by shame. The penitent swore that he would tell the whole truth. He touched the earth with a finger, which he then put to his lips, and he threw incense into the fire. He was thus bound by an oath, and to the earth, and to the fire, or the sun, that is to say, to the supreme duality. Then he told his life at length, and recounted all his sins. When he had finished, the priest sent him a penance that would vary in severity: short or lengthy fasts, scarification of the tongue, it might be pierced through and have as many as 800 thorns or straws pushed through the wound, sacrifices to Tlazolteotl, and various austerities. Once the penance was done, the man could no longer be punished upon this earth. The priest was bound to the most absolute secrecy, for that which he had heard was not for him, but had been said secretly for the deity. Death and the hereafter. Two sets of funerary rites were in use among the Aztecs: cremation and burial. All those who died of drowning were buried, as well as those who had been killed by lightning, and those who have died of leprosy, gout, or dropsy. In short, all who had been marked out and withdrawn from this world by the gods of the water and of the rain. The body of a drowned man, in particular, was regarded with the utmost religious awe, for it was believed that when an Indian was drowned in the lake, he had been dragged to the bottom by the Ahuitzotl, a fabulous creature. When the body came to the surface again, showing no wound, but with its eyes, nails, and teeth gone, torn out by the Ahuitzotl, nobody dare touch it. They went to tell the priests. It was said that the divine Tlaloque had sent the drowned man's soul to the earthly paradise, and because of this, the body was carried out with great respect upon a litter to be buried in one of the oratories that are called Ayucalco, little temples of the water gods on the shore of the lake. The litter was decorated with reeds, and they played on the flute before the body. And then, as we have seen, the women who died in labor and who were deified were burnt in the court of the temple of the Sihuapipitli. All of their bodies were cremated. In the course of time, all the civilized tribes of Mexico have used either one form or the other. We need mention no more than the funerary chambers of the Mayas in Palenque, and those of the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs of Monte Alban, and the famous pyre of Quetzalcoatl, for the tradition of the Toltecs was that of cremation. The nomadic peoples of the north buried their dead, but adopted the Toltec custom. At least the chief families did so. King Ixtlisochitl of Texcoco was the first ruler of that dynasty, whose body was burnt according to the rites and ceremonies of the Toltecs. It is probable that the old settled nations of the plateau practiced burial, and this would explain why the dead who had been marked out by Tlaloc and his fellows should have had this form of interment reserved for them. In Aztec times, the two kinds of ceremony existed side by side, and the family's choice was determined only by the manner of the death. Important people were solemnly buried in vaulted underground chambers. The anonymous conquistador tells how he himself took part in the opening of a tomb in which they found a dead man seated upon a chair with his shield, his sword, and his jewels about him. The tomb contained gold to the value of 3,000 castellanos. Father Francisco de Bologna also describes an underground chapel in which the body was seated upon an ikpali, splendidly dressed and surrounded by weapons and gems. When the dead man had been a very high dignitary or a ruler, some of his wives and servants were killed, those who of their own free will wished to die with him, and they were buried or cremated, as the case might be, so that they should be able to follow him into the hereafter. When the cremation of a body was intended, it was dressed in its best clothes and fastened in a squatting position, with the knees drawn up to the chin. Then the whole was wrapped in several layers of cloth, kept in place by hands, so as to form a kind of funerary bundle or mummy. Dead kings are always shown like this in historical records. The mummy was then carefully decorated with paper and feather ornaments, and a mask of carved stone or mosaic was fixed in the place of the face. Rulers were adorned like Huitzilopochtli, with royal and sacred ornaments, or with clothes bearing the great gods as symbols. Then, to the sound of the funeral chants, Mika Kwikat, the corpse, watched over by the elders, was burnt upon a pyre. When the cremation was over, the ashes and the bones were collected and put into a jar, together with a piece of jade, the symbol of life, and this jar was buried in the house. The ashes of the emperors were preserved in the temple of Huitzilopochtli. Some of the dead, as we have seen, have been chosen by the gods for a life beyond death. For the companions of the eagle, and for the valiant women, there was to be joy of the sun's palaces, full of light and sound, and for those beloved of Tlaloc, an endless peaceful happiness, careless and idle, in the warm gardens of the east. But most of the dead were held to go under the earth, into the dark world of Mictlan. To help the dead man in the bitter trials that he would have to overcome, they gave him a companion, a dog which they killed and burnt together with him. There were also offerings burned for him 80 days after the funeral, and again at the end of a year, and again after 2, 3, and 4 years. It was thought that when the 4 years had passed, the dead man would have arrived at the end of his journey among the shadows, for then he would have reached the ninth hell, the last place of Mictlan, the place of his eternal rest. This concludes Chapter 5.